Can I tell you a very Lawfare celebrity impression story? My grandfather, weirdly, which is really weird when you know what I look like and you know what this gentleman I'm about to describe looks like. My grandfather was a doppelganger, identical twin of J. Edgar Hoover, but like 30 years younger than him. But J. Edgar Hoover was, among other things, a very vain man and continued to use his like professional FBI portrait when he was 40 years old, well into the end of his career, when it was like in his late 70s, early 80s, something like that. So my grandfather used to be able to go around Washington, D.C. and get a table at any restaurant in town because he would just put on a very sober suit and just walk in and just go in and put his name down, a very ambiguous, something like John Doe or something like that, and would just wait, and the waiters would whisper and then look at him. My grandmother would be like, "Boy, this is very entertaining," and then they would get a table somewhere off in a corner.
That's incredible.
It's the original deepfake.
Who is everyone's celebrity doppelganger?
Oh, people who look like me do not make it into celebrity circles.
When I had a beard, I was Steven Spielberg. And,
I can see that.
I would get free drinks at bars in New York. And,
wow.
That's amazing.
And tremendous disappointment when they discovered who I was.
All these aspiring actors working in bars and restaurants.
And I always wonder, why does he need a free drink? I need a free drink. But Steven Spielberg does not need a free drink.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am your host, Scott R. Anderson. Thrilled to have you with us on the show, where members of the Lawfare team work with you to try and make sense of the week's biggest national security news stories. And boy, is there more to make sense of now than ever before in the last week's news. Hopefully, you appreciated your brief reprieve where you got to hear me and a number of our current guests and a number of our former co-hosts talk about the outcome of the election last week that ran in place of our regular episode. We are back in regular form. Do not worry. Do not despair. We will be back with you every week talking through the wave of news stories and big questions that are no doubt coming down the pike as we wrestle with the outcome of this historic election and what it means for national security. As we take an initial stab at a few of those issues that are already coming to the fore, I'm thrilled to be joined by several of my Lawfare colleagues, including Eugenia Lostri. Eugenia, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Roger Parloff. Roger, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a while, Roger. I looked back. I didn't realize how long it's been. You're overdue to come back on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
We're thrilled to have you. And, of course, the inestimable Anna Bauer. Anna, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we have got a lot going on in the news this week related to our country, related to national security, more than we can talk about. And we have a lot of stories that we are going to be coming back to, no doubt, in the weeks and months to come, up until January 20th when we have a new Trump administration, and no doubt afterwards. But for our first slate of issues, our first week here after the election of our regular episode, we wanted to pick out a couple topics that particularly came to mind, and at least one topic that is not about Donald Trump. And that is our commitment to you. We will have at least one topic that does not center on our new incoming president each week moving forward. For our first topic, putting the Dismal in dismissal. Donald Trump's election as president for a second time puts the state and federal criminal charges against him and potentially some of his supporters and co-conspirators in unprecedented historical territory. Where do these cases seem to be headed, and what will it mean for the broader effort at accountability, especially around the insurrection on January 6th? Topic 2, taking Bytes Out of Crime. BYTES. For the record, for the audio medium, these puns never really quite carry. As one of its last acts in power, the Biden administration seems poised to support a forthcoming UN convention on cybercrime, despite reservations among some observers that it may be abused by autocratic regimes and strategic rivals. Why is the Biden administration tempted by the treaty, and what will its support at this late hour mean in practice? And topic 3, meme of rivals. Donald Trump is only 1 week in as president-elect, but has already released a flurry of appointments and rumored appointments for senior positions in his forthcoming administration. Those appointed, or rumored to be soon appointed, range from established Republicans like Senator Marco Rubio, rumored to be Trump's pick for Secretary of State, to iconoclasts like billionaire Elon Musk, who's co-heading a Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. An apparent reference to cryptocurrency that I can say with some confidence no one really finds as funny as he does. What should we make of these selections thus far and the process behind them? So for our first topic, let us dig into this question of the Trump trials. We have had a lot of conversations about this internally over the last week or two. Well, last week, I should say, since we know the result of the election. Although contemplating how it might play out in the event that Donald Trump did win is something that we've been talking about for well over a year now within Lawfare. As folks listening to our podcasts here and other podcasts have discussed and heard us talk about. But now we're actually seeing it play out in kind of fast format in some ways, in some cases. We have some action happening in the federal cases, or at least rumored to be happening, reporting on planning by special counsel Jack Smith about how they're planning to approach those cases. We are seeing some initial action in New York State Court about efforts to both resolve outstanding issues there. I'm not aware of any action yet in Georgia court, but I'm sure some folks on this recording will hopefully be able to fill us up to speed on that. And of course, we have a whole range of defendants in January 6th related cases who are using Trump's election as a potential basis for seeking delays or postponements or other ways to curb the outcome of their cases in their favor, including a potential presidential pardon, which Trump has promised from the campaign trail. Anna, let me turn to you initially on this issue. Bring us up to speed a little bit. Tell us where we know we are in these cases. And what jumps out to you about the big outstanding questions? Where do you think the big questions are moving forward, the things we need to look at in the weeks to come? And what do we already know in terms of where things seem to be headed?
Right. So let's start with the federal cases. Those cases, the classified documents case first, was dismissed by Judge Eileen Cannon based on this appointments clause argument that Trump's attorneys made. That was up on appeal at the 11th Circuit and still is up on appeal. But there are lingering questions as to how the Justice Department and the Special Counsel's Office will approach pursuing that appeal now that Trump has been elected. Similarly, with the January 6th case in Washington, D.C., which finally got back to Judge Chutkan, and there was this first round of briefing on the presidential immunity question in which Jack Smith and his team submitted this very long brief that kind of set out the facts that they intend to present at trial if the case ever were to get to trial. That has now seemingly been cut short, or will presumably be cut short in terms of that briefing on the immunity question, because there has now been reporting that with respect to the federal cases, Jack Smith and his team are consulting with other Justice Department components and leadership to try to figure out the best way to wind down this case. We got our first public look at that when the special counsel's office filed a motion to vacate deadlines that are upcoming in the January 6th case. They basically told Judge Chutkan, we need some more time to consider how Trump's reelection, or are we calling it reelection at this point, or is it's kind of hard to know because he's not a sitting president. So he's been reelected for a second term, but it's non-consecutive. So I'm not entirely sure, but the filing basically told Judge Chutkan, we are still considering how to deal with the election of the criminal defendant in this case, and we need some more time to work that out and to consult with each other and other Justice Department components. And so we'll get back to you by December 2nd. So we're waiting to see what Jack Smith's team will file in terms of how they plan to move forward. And then we're also still waiting, as I mentioned, to see exactly how they'll deal with the 11th Circuit appeal. One reason why that's a little bit different is, A, the Justice Department might not want this precedent to kind of remain on the books in the Southern District of Florida, the order or opinion that Judge Cannon issued in which she dismissed the case. There also are two co-defendants in that case. It is possible and perhaps even very probable that Trump would pardon those co-defendants in that case in any event, but it may very well be that the Justice Department and Jack Smith's team want to continue to pursue that appeal to some extent. So it's really kind of unclear. There's also been reporting that Smith intends to resign before Trump is inaugurated and the transition into office actually occurs, there's also been some speculation that it could be the case that one reason for that is that Smith intends to write a report. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, will ultimately have discretion, so long as he is in office, to whether or not that report would be released to the public. But Garland has previously indicated that he would be willing to release special counsel reports to the public, as he did, for example, with the special counsel's report about the classified documents investigation related to Joe Biden. So those are a few things related to the federal cases. We're still not entirely sure what will happen going forward, but we should know within the next few weeks. In New York, meanwhile, Trump had some, pending action. There was first, we expected on November 12th that there would be a decision from Justice Merchan about the immunity motion that Trump's team made, in which they argued that on the basis of the Supreme Court's presidential immunity decision, Trump's conviction should be vacated and thrown out. We expected a decision on that, but that was delayed because Trump's team and then the prosecution as well requested a bit of a delay on those deadlines so that the prosecution could assess what its view is on how the case should proceed if it is not dismissed. Trump's sentencing was set for November 26th. That presumably will potentially be put off because there's a new deadline for November 19th. The prosecution is set by then to tell Justice Merchan how it believes he should proceed in terms of sentencing. So we have this slight delay there. It could very well be the case Trump is still sentenced before he is inaugurated in January. But if that happens, it's widely expected that even if he is sentenced, especially if he is sentenced to a period of confinement, then that would be delayed at least until 2029 when he is out of office. But again, we will see what the view of the prosecution team is there and then how the defense responds. And then finally, in Fulton County, keep in mind that case as against Trump and many of the co-defendants is already stayed at the trial court level because the Court of Appeals in Georgia is considering the question of whether or not Fani Willis should be disqualified. But there has been reporting that Trump's team is preparing to request dismissal of the case based on his reelection. We also know that Steve Sadow has argued in the past before Judge McAfee that if Trump were to be elected, then the case would at the very minimum need to be put on pause until he is out of office in 2029. So there is some expected filings that may be forthcoming there with respect to the effect of Trump's election on the case. But the case against the co-defendants, if Fani Willis is not disqualified, should go forward, in my view. We may very well see some of the co-defendants making some arguments based on Trump's election, although, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what those arguments would be. Some of them have already mounted a supremacy clause, immunity type of defense. So I think that maybe they could try to bring in something about Trump's election, but keep in mind that these are state charges. They are not eligible for pardons from the president because that only applies to federal crimes. And so, in my view, at least, the case against the co-defendants should be able to go forward, although there may be a few complications, as we've talked about before, about the impact of the presidential immunity decision, how it could potentially impact evidence being introduced against these co-defendants. Keep in mind, this is a RICO conspiracy case. Anything that would have been introduced against Trump is expected to be introduced against these co-defendants. And so there's some questions there, but hopefully that sums it all up.
No, that is a lot to bite off and a lot to think about there. And I want to dig into some of these legal issues. Before we do, though, let's bring in the other universe of cases, because of course we have Donald Trump as a defendant, but then we have hundreds of other defendants in the January 6th cases who are also saying his election foundationally changes the case against them, or at least the circumstances in which it's arising. Roger, talk to us about this. I mean, how are we seeing the J6 defendants react? Remember, these are the people who, in a lot of ways, had a starring role in the campaign, from the J6 choir, and one of the more absurd aspects of that, to being a talking point that Trump returned to again and again, at least several of them, about how unfairly they've been treated. What is the expectation about where these cases seem to be headed?
Well, the people that are awaiting sentence immediately, or or trial, those people many of them are moving for continuances. And they're citing the promises, Trump's promises of pardons. And some of the, so far, the DOJ has opposed all of those, and many judges have already rejected those. There's one judge, Judge Contreras, who's holding a Zoom conference the 14th on one of these, which was a little surprising to me. A number of these are cookie cutter things by a single lawyer, but multiple lawyers have filed them. Some also mention the fact that DOJ conceded that they should pause deadlines in the Trump cases, but obviously that's a special case. There's no problem ignoring those. But in this one case that's being heard tomorrow, the status conference, it's a 2-week case. It is a felony, but it's sort of a borderline felony. And there definitely has been, the DOJ is trying to conserve resources and make a push to really, I think their highest priority is to arrest the felons, the serious felons that are still outstanding before the 20th. And so there may be a sense that spending 2 weeks on a case, this fellow tomorrow has a picture of himself with Trump. At least it purports to be a picture of himself with Trump. So it could be a monumental waste of time. So that particular person had made the argument, I don't have the language in front of me, but he had, quote unquote, warned the judge that he did not want to get into a, quote, cycle of escalating retribution, and in essence that in his view, it would be a good time to it was the last chance to make peace. So then he sort of switched from that into a more conventional judicial economy argument, which I think is being received in a better way. But we don't know yet what Contreras will do. All the other judges have been very unreceptive. The key thing, if there are pardons, is where he'll draw the line. Obviously a lot of people saying, well, nonviolent defendants. Violence is a little hard to discern sometimes in a riot. Everyone there is making it difficult for the officers to do their jobs. It looks like at least 38% of the cases are, undoubtedly violent. Those are all assaults on officers. And maybe a third of those are assaults with weapons. So there's no way to call those nonviolent. There's 10 more that are assaults on media. It'll be interesting to see whether he regards that as violence. And then there's another at least 10 convictions for seditious conspiracy, which is the use of force, conspiring to use the use of force, not necessarily using it. So, having an arsenal over in Virginia waiting to be used, but not using it ultimately. So those will be, and then there's things like impeding officers, which is not quite assaulting them, but blocking them, nudging them, pushing them. I guess that's probably nonviolent. I don't know. So there's a lot to be cleared up.
So, the biggest outstanding question here in my mind is the state cases, right? Because that's kind of the unsettled legal territory in regards to Donald Trump, I should say. The federal cases will go away. The federal cases against January 6th defendants hinge entirely on the scope of an actual pardon, with the possible exception of maybe Judge Contreras, maybe some other judges will find some sort of argument amenable that they should do something while waiting for a pardon. But that seems to make a lot of assumptions about how certain that pardon is for all the defendants. So I agree. That seems like a dubious judicial move, but who the heck knows? It's weird times. It's a weird fact pattern. I sympathize with anyone who has to wrestle with any aspect of this. But the biggest open question is the New York case and the Georgia case in terms of how you balance those equities, right? Like this idea about state rule of law and here state supremacy over these particular types of offenses, the fact they have a plenary police authority over the violent crimes of the sorts that are being elected, about state election crimes, about business registration in the case of the New York case, versus federal supremacy, the idea that we have an elected president. Being a criminal is not disqualifying for being president, and he has to be able to function as president. So how do we see them balancing this out? Roger, I want to start with you, and I'll come to you, Anna, because you guys have followed these cases closer than anyone. Like, how do we expect judges to balance these different equities in these two cases? And does the fact they're in a different posture help maybe or lead to potentially a different outcome between New York and Georgia, setting aside the personalities involved and all the other differentiating characteristics?
Well, the New York case is unique because we have a jury conviction. We're very far along. There isn't really much Trump has to do except show up for sentencing. The new piece of it, and let me describe what the document that Anna described to you. When they put off the sentence, put off these deadlines, that happened yesterday formally. Apparently it happened Sunday afternoon in an email thread, and the email thread was made public. And there are a couple interesting things about it. So the prosecutor tells the judge that the defense has come to him. They want to pause it. They're saying, we don't object. We need to look at this. We need to balance a jury conviction against, the legitimate interests of the office of the president. And then we get a glimpse of what Trump might have told the people, Danny, the district attorney. They're looking, among other things, at a note to Title III USC Section 102. It's the Presidential Transition Act of 1963. And this note, which is sort of like I think it's a preamble to the statute, to the law that created this statute. It says things like, the Congress declares it to be the purpose of this act to promote orderly transfer of executive power, ... The national interest requires that such transitions in the office of president be accomplished so as to assure continuity, ... Any disruption, ... could produce results detrimental to the safety and well-being of the United States and its people. It's the intent of Congress that appropriate actions be authorized and taken to avoid any minimal disruption. It then says it wants all government officials, and that would mean federal government officials, to take appropriate lawful steps to minimize disruption. So they're going to say that has something to say about the. I don't think it has, literally any binding. I think the overwhelming question is whether there's sort of a sense of patriotism that, okay, he won this election, he won it with the popular vote. Do we give him sort of a shave and a haircut and it's a new page and we let him start over? Or, do we continue with and finish up business? And I don't know how he's going to resolve that difficult question. Of course, if he decides to dismiss it, nobody can say that he's a convicted criminal anymore. It will vacate the convictions. And none of these will have been successful. On the other hand, it is obviously the most controversial case, arguably penny ante case, many would say. So it's a really, I don't know how this will come out.
Well, yeah, and worth flagging, I think that same law is the same transition act that the Trump transition team has refused to comply with so far, because they have not yet signed with the statutorily required MOU that would be required for them to actually engage with federal agencies over it. So there's a little irony there. I wonder if that will come back to bite them in the litigation. Anna, what do you think about this? I mean, the thing that jumps out to me, and I'd be curious about your reactions as somebody who has been in law school much more recently than Roger and I, so there may be case law on this I missed. I don't think there's any, frankly, even remotely relevant federal case law I can directly think of about, is it necessary? How do you reconcile these competing interests between a president being, having to fulfill the office of the presidency, the obligations that entails, directly conflicting with state law if there is a conviction, if the conviction in New York stands? I guess it's a little easier with, if there's a voluntary standing down of prosecutors in Georgia. The closest you can get, I can think of cases with congressmen who have been prosecuted and actually run for office and served out their terms in prison, dating back to close to the time of the framers. I'm thinking of one late 19th century case. I'm blanking on the name of the gentleman now, but that was a federal prosecution, it's worth noting. But nonetheless, he was seen as, yeah, you can still serve out your term in Congress. They gave him a little leeway to participate in some things, but in the end, that being elected to Congress didn't disqualify him from being prosecuted. Obviously, federal prosecutors don't feel that way, but how do state prosecutors think about that? How does that weigh in, Anna? How does this weigh in? And in Georgia in particular, is it a done deal that this case against Trump is just not going to go forward, even if the related issues on appeal get cleaned up about Fani Willis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, and it's something that I need to do a little bit more research in. I think you're right, Scott, that we don't have anything directly on point, although there are examples. I think that there's also maybe a sitting Supreme Court justice who was thrown in debtor's prison at one point while serving as a Supreme Court justice. This was way back in the day. There's examples of high-ranking federal officials, again, many, many years ago, who had arrest warrants out or, that kind of thing. But there's nothing that I'm aware of that is directly on point and that goes to the unique constitutional role of the president. And so I will say that I think the New York case is quite different from the Georgia case in that the president or the president-elect Trump has already been through the burdens of litigation, as the case law often describes it. That's one of the kind of policy reasons why when there's a person who is the president, you want to avoid, putting a bunch of burdens of litigation on them because it could interfere with their ability to perform their duties. In the New York case, the bulk of that burden has already been shouldered. He's sat through the trial. You wouldn't really be dealing with interfering with Trump's rights to be there for a trial or to kind of involve himself in his own defense and that kind of thing, and have these competing kind of policy concerns between his ability to defend himself against criminal charges and then also be the president of the United States. You really just have this question of does the sentence in any way interfere with him performing his duties? And if you postpone it, then the answer is no. But I don't really see a situation in which the Supreme Court of the United States would allow Justice Merchan to sentence him to a period of confinement and then immediately implement it during any part of his term. I think the answer to that would be that the president has to be able to, for example, go and visit foreign countries and meet with, partners in other territories and do all of these things, speaking to the American people. You can't really do that I guess you can, but you can't do that as effectively from a prison cell. And so I think there's all of these reasons why the Supreme Court would say, okay, you've immediately implemented this period of confinement, but you can't do that because he's got to be the president. So you've at least got to put it off. In the Georgia case, it is a bit different. I honestly don't see any way in which this case goes forward while he is a sitting president because of the reasons that I mentioned where, you have a bunch of different competing kind of policy issues where, yes, the state does have an interest in prosecuting a person who did alleged crimes, but at the same time, the president has to be able to perform his duties, and there's this conflict between doing that and being present at a 6-month, what prosecutors have said would be about a 6-month trial. And I just don't think that that is something that can happen during his presidency.
One last data point that won't help us at all, but and I don't remember the facts, so maybe I don't have it right, but Vice President Agnew, I think, was prosecuted federally during his term, but it doesn't really tell us anything.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, speaking of criminal law matters, let us turn to criminal law in a very different domain, the cyber domain. Which is something you can only say with that level of excitement in your voice, because we are seeing the Biden administration take a pretty interesting step this week in the story that, as promised, has very little to do with Donald Trump, although he may come up once or twice over the course of discussing this, because the Biden administration in its last few months in office, last few months in power, among the steps it appears to be taking is backing a somewhat controversial, for relatively nonpartisan reasons, UN convention relating to cybercrime that's being debated, I believe, in the General Assembly, if I'm correct on that. Eugenia, you have done a lot of work on this convention. You have been following it closely. Talk to us a little bit about why the convention has proven controversial, what the goal of it is, and what people are worried about it, and why the Biden administration may be tempted by it.
So, first off, I'm glad to be bringing the non-Trump coverage here. It's always
somebody has to.
Somebody has to. I'm glad my services are being valued. I'm going to try and be brief with the context around the Cybercrime Convention in the UN. There is a lot of very good coverage that we've done on Lawfare, so if people are very interested in hearing how all of this came about, please go see, read, and listen to all of our work. But basically, this was originally a Russian proposal to the United Nations saying, look, there is only one cybercrime convention. This is the Budapest Convention. It was negotiated by European countries. It doesn't really reflect the needs of the global community. And there should really be a convention negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations that incorporates all of the views. And this was originally not a very popular submission. It was, I believe, if I recall correctly, it passed with like 10 votes in favor a few months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was very well timed on their end. So they've been negotiating this convention for 2 years. And that sounds like a long time, but it's not really a long time when it comes to international negotiations. As you can imagine, getting all of the countries to agree on something takes a long time, as much as we dread it. Now, the reason why this convention has been problematic or has raised concerns is because for a very long time, throughout all of the negotiations, actually, there was very little agreement between all of the negotiating parties about what should be included, what is the convention actually about, what crimes are we talking about, what are the limits of cooperation, is there going to be support for other countries, what are the levels of transparency that we expect, and what are the safeguards and protections for human rights that should be included. All of this, it was a complete back and forth all the time. Even during the concluding session, the parties were not really in agreement and they had to extend and had a resumed session. So it wasn't clear until the very end what type of convention we were going to get. And once we got it, there was a lot of concern from the unlikely pairing of academia, civil society, and the private sector that is actually going to have to implement a lot of this and have to be heavily involved in it, that this was not a good convention, that it actually was undermining human rights protections. There's concerns about states using the treaty to justify violations, extraterritorial surveillance, harassment of employees, and abuse of privacy all around. Right? So that's without going into a detailed account of everything that the convention includes, those are some of the main concerns that have been raised, and those are pretty broad and very worrisome concerns to have about a global convention to counter crime.
So I think that kind of tees up the natural question, which is, why is this tempting to the Biden administration? A lot of the critics of this are kind of coming from the Biden side of the political spectrum, at least in the U.S. political spectrum. Kind of the civil libertarian, people worried about free speech, people who, frankly, after the election results, may be particularly worried about free speech, and particularly in terms of giving authority to the government over things that relate to free speech directly or indirectly, like a variety of online activities. So why does the Biden administration find it tempting, and how are they addressing these critics and these concerns?
So that's a very interesting question. It's one that I've had for some time, and I don't know that I'm completely satisfied with the answers that we've heard from the Biden administration. The truth is that the convention was adopted in the ad hoc committee by consensus. And even though there are these concerns, the way that not only from the US side, but also general allies, Western democracy side, the concern is that taking a step back now after the draft has been adopted by consensus would raise interesting questions about, whether they can be trusted as partners in negotiations, because they've actually, even though this was a Russian proposal, even though they originally did not want this convention to move forward, they invested the time, the effort, they built some sort of consensus, and they were able to fight back a lot of the authoritarian tendencies that were introduced by other countries, right? So there was a lot of work. The convention is much better than what it would have been if the Russian original proposal had been left unchecked. And if they do not continue to engage, there is a risk that the treaty, which will very likely, I don't really see how it would not be adopted at this stage, that could be further abused, and there would be no one present to try to counter that, right? And so that's partially the argument, that they need to continue to be in the room, and deciding now to take a step back would just allow further abuse. And the other part of it is that some countries actually think that there are enough protections, and that if that it should not be abused, and that having a general protection of human rights, even though there is no actual convention required, or no actual commitment to the protection of human rights required in the text, well, it should not be, they would not abuse it, so that's okay, and that's enough. And so you have a little bit of both, in the sense that they say, well, if other countries want to abuse it, we'll be there to prevent it. For that, we need to allow this to continue to move forward. And we are basically the good guys. So that should be okay.
So what do you think Trump is going to do with this?
I don't think he's going to do much with it. I think he's going to allow this to continue, especially if this is something that Russia wants to move forward. I don't know that he will or at least I haven't heard any sort of statements about this from the Trump camp. I think, Scott, actually, this might be a good way for you to tell us a little bit about what it looks like to adopt this internally once the General Assembly votes on it in like a month.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It actually bears on all the members. So the terms of the convention, as I read them, say it doesn't enter into force until 40 member states actually ratify it, essentially, deposit instruments of ratification with the UN itself, I think, is the depository in this case for the convention. I could be misremembering. And so that means the General Assembly basically votes and approves, saying this is a General Assembly convention. That it gives it some legal weight. Like, often conventions like this are viewed as being strongly indicative of customary international law, where they are kind of framed as reflecting that. I don't know how much of this treaty would actually do that, but that's one way it can have force, even if not ratified. And we do see documents become really instrumental, even when they're not ratified as treaties. So like the most prominent example in my mind is the articles on the responsibility of states in regard to wrongful acts, which are super influential in shaping how we talk about international law and how states understand international law, but were never actually ratified by members. They were just voted on by the General Assembly. That said, something like this that is much more operational, much more about actual cooperation and setting up these sorts of frameworks, you do need some sort of domestic ratification. In the United States, one way to do that, the kind of most conventional way, is through advice and consent of the Senate with 2/3 support. Incredibly high threshold, really hard to get, other than things like NATO expansion and a few other very narrow issues. Really, really hard to get any sort of support at that level in the United States Senate these days, especially because there's a lot of inherent distrust, particularly among Republicans, about a lot of international institutions and processes. Now, I don't believe this has an independent tribunal, which is the sort of thing that has held up like the Law of the Sea Convention, because it actually doesn't talk as much about vested rights in a binding way, at least from my kind of fairly cursory review of it. It's a fairly long convention. I was impressed by how detailed it is. So my reading of it did not get as in-depth as it probably should. But I didn't see a lot of...
Not detailed enough, though.
It might not be detailed enough. For an international convention, very suppressively detailed. That alone may be enough to give a little more wiggle room and raise less concerns in the Senate. But I don't know. Like, it depends, frankly, whether the Trump administration is willing to push and try and get Republicans on board affirmatively to support it. Maybe they will, but that would be, my guess is that if that happens, it's going to be a ways down the road because it's just not going to be a high priority for them. And this thing can sit on, there's no immediate urgency unless you want to use the treaty, because once the General Assembly approves it, you can ratify it any time in the next several years or a decade. Sometimes ratifications come decades after the fact. It is worth noting, you don't, unlike some reporting on this I've read, I don't think you actually necessarily have to do advice and consent on this. Sometimes presidents will approve treaties on the basis of approval by just Congress, so bicameral majority support, which is easier to get a lot of times. So like a lot of trade treaties are confirmed that way. The exact line about what requires advice and consent and what can be done that way is done kind of by practice and a sort of handshake agreement between the Senate and the executive branch. And I'm not 100% sure where on this line that would fall, but my sense is there's none of the clear indicators I think of as usually meaning requiring advice and consent, which is usually things about, human rights treaties, defense treaties, big treaties like that. I don't think this sort of mutual cooperation, it's certainly I can think of other law enforcement cooperation treaties that are done as congressional executive agreements. So I think this is a possibility there. The other possibility, frankly, is that the executive branch could look at the laws and authorities it already has and say, I can already implement this myself. And they can just sign it as what is called a sole executive agreement, or in this case, something closer to a ex post congressional executive agreement, meaning they basically say, Congress has already given us the authority to implement this. We're going to sign off on it. Those are more controversial actions among international lawyers and domestic constitutional lawyers because it really is pushing the president's authority in a pretty solid direction because, of course, Congress didn't vote on saying we're always going to have it this way and that we're going to agree to an binding international convention about it. But there have been cases where the executive branch in the past under Republican and Democratic administrations have done stuff like that. So there's a copyright convention a few years ago where the Obama administration did exactly that sort of step. And you could see the executive branch maybe doing that here if they have trouble getting Congress on board one way or the other. So there's a variety of avenues you could be implemented here. The other way, a lot of it, again, maybe they just never join the convention, but they start cooperating with it anyway. Because insofar as a lot of these are just expectations and kind of dictating procedures, they can say, yeah, we're not a party to this, but we're going to play along to the full extent we can in line with the authorities we have available to us. And that might be enough in a lot of these cases. It won't help strengthen the treaty, but it'll get the U.S. cooperating with it in the way that might be useful, might get other states to reciprocate, even if they're not technically obligated to do so. But it all depends on what the executive branch wants to do with it. I just don't know where this would fit in Trump's broader policy agenda.
Let me just add one more thing to your point about what the treaty can accomplish even before it is adopted domestically. I think this has been a concern raised by many people who have been paying attention to this. It's not necessarily how this is going to be adopted and implemented in the United States or by many of the countries where we think that there is a stronger rule of law. I think a lot of the concern comes from the quote unquote kind of UN washing, that having the text to this convention be adopted by consensus by the ad hoc committee, passed by the third committee, and eventually adopted by the General Assembly can raise. It's about those third countries that maybe don't have the standing to, or the internal capacity to stand up to other countries that maybe are requesting more information than they should for crimes that they deem serious. But we would look at, this is clearly a country going after a dissident, and they're just trying to get as much information as they can from a third country that is not going to be able to stand up to them. And now they can point to something like a UN convention and say, well, we have the standing to do this. This is something that we all agreed to. And I think that's the concerning part in what even if the United States does not sign up, and I don't think anyone's saying, Russia's going to be able to demand things of the United States now. That's not really where the concern lies. And so even though, of course, we are talking about what Trump would do, what would it look like, 40 countries might not be that hard to get. It might not be that hard to get 40 countries to get, to actually ratify and have the convention enter into force. And then it might not be that hard to get enough countries to actually expand the scope of crimes. Right now, the scope of crimes in the convention very closely mirrors what the Budapest Convention includes. Most of the, content crimes or cyber-enabled crimes have been left out. But that doesn't mean that they'll be left out forever, because there is a process that is pretty straightforward where you could get 60 countries to agree by a 2/3 majority to have an additional protocol that actually expands the list of crimes, right? And those are not thresholds that are impossible to reach, especially in the tense geopolitical context that we live in right now. And so I just want to kind of part with that concern.
A ray of optimism for those supporting cybercrime accountability. Always welcome in these halls. Well, the big outstanding question on this issue, like so many issues, is, of course, what the Trump administration is going to do with this convention when they come to power on January 20th. And that question will be answered by the people who President Trump appoints to advise him on national security matters. And in the last week, we have gotten some clues about who those people will be. From Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Department of Homeland Security, to the Department of Defense. We've gotten a number of nods or a number of reports about likely choices for those positions. Anna, let me turn to you on this. Give us a quick overview about who the big figures are in the national security space we know and who the outstanding questions are, I suppose, which are just as important. Get a little sense about, your take on this. What is the unifying thread, if any, of these people that we're seeing so far? What does it tell us about Trump's team that's beginning to come together, and how much of it is what we expected, how much of it is a bit of a departure?
Yeah, so we've seen a number of announcements in the past week or so from the Trump transition team about who is expected to be appointed or placed in senior national security roles. One of the first announcements that we got was Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security Advisor will be Stephen Miller. He was previously a senior advisor and speechwriter to Trump during the first administration. He was reportedly a lead architect in Trump's plans for mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. He's been a surrogate throughout the campaign for Trump, who has voiced support and enthusiasm for mass deportations. And some of these first announcements around Trump cabinet members and appointments has certainly surrounded this theme of immigration policy. So following the announcement of Stephen Miller, there was announcements about Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, as Secretary of Homeland Security. South Dakota, of course, is a state that does not share a border with any foreign territory and is closer to Canada than it is to Mexico, for example, which has been a big emphasis amongst the Trump campaign in terms of Homeland Security. But Noem has been a supporter of Trump's hardline immigration policies. And as a part of that announcement that she's expected to be appointed as Secretary of Homeland Security, the Trump campaign, or transition team rather, said that she would work closely with his pick for border czar, which is Tom Homan. Homan is the former acting ICE director during the previous Trump administration, and he was the so-called father of the family separation policy. So again, all of these picks underscoring that the Trump campaign very much does intend to implement its quite aggressive promises about mass deportation and hardline immigration policies. We yesterday had some indication of who the Secretary of Defense pick is. That's Pete Hegseth, who served in the military in the Army National Guard, but who actually lacks any senior military experience or national security experience. He is best known as a Fox News personality who hosts Fox and Friends Weekend. He has echoed Trump's sentiments that the American military is not masculine enough, and has made statements suggesting, for example, that women should not serve in combat roles. Additionally, we've had CIA Director John Ratcliffe. He served as Director of National Intelligence in the final months of the previous Trump administration. Then there are some folks who are a little bit more experienced that have been announced. So one of those is Marco Rubio, the Florida senator who has a history of an acrimonious relationship with Trump, but who ultimately became quite loyal to Trump and campaigned for him throughout this campaign season. He, again, is one of the Trump picks who does have significant experience for this position. He's worked on both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee. There's also Michael Waltz, who was Trump's pick for National Security Advisor. He's a Florida congressman, former Green Beret, who has taken a quite tough line on China, but was a member of the Armed Services Intelligence and Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. And his wife was the Homeland Security Advisor during the first Trump administration. Finally, we've got U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Elise Stefanik, the Congresswoman for New York State, and U.S. Ambassador to Israel. The pick is Mike Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor, whose daughter also served as press secretary during Trump's first administration and is now the governor of Arkansas. So I think that rounds out who we've had announcements about, but we're still waiting for some big indications about positions that Trump has been particularly interested in. We know from reporting that Attorney General is the position that he is very much wants to make what he sees as the right selection. It's unclear at this time who that could be, but he wants to choose, it's been reported, someone who is loyal to him. He was unhappy with his previous picks, reportedly Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, and is being very careful about selecting Attorney General. There's also been indications that Trump may plan to replace Chris Wray as the FBI director, and we do not know yet who that could be, although, you know, there are some folks who are rumored to be on shortlists for other positions, such as Kash Patel, who have not had an announced position in the upcoming administration. And so I think that we're keeping our eyes on some of those positions in terms of national security and Department of Justice affairs. So I hope that rounds it out, but let me know if I missed anything. Roger, Scott, Eugenia, do you have anything that I missed?
Well, I would say actually two positions that are pretty influential that we haven't heard much yet, but there are rumors of, are both Treasury and Commerce Secretary, which we don't usually think of national security gigs, but they increasingly are because economic sanctions, which are under Treasury, and export controls now predominantly controlled by Commerce, are hugely influential foreign policy tools, particularly in relation to China and critical technologies. And so there were rumored that there's a couple of candidates. Scott Bessent is rumored, and we have betting markets leading him. He's a kind of hedge fund manager and a Trump backer, somebody who actually used to work for George Soros back in the day. He's kind of the leading Treasury candidate. Howard Lutnick, who's leading the transition team, is another potential candidate there. And then for Commerce Secretary, Linda McMahon is the name that seems to be coming up most commonly. But we haven't seen either one announced yet. And it's probably a sign that, given how well-heeled a lot of Trump's backers are, those two positions are probably highly sought after. There's a lot of debate about among who might actually end up filling them.
Yeah, and Scott, I also will add something else that isn't necessarily national security directly related, but is just kind of something to keep an eye on, is this announcement about a new government department, the Department of Government Efficiency, aka DOGE, which will be headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, two staunch supporters of Trump. It's kind of unclear to me what exactly this department will be doing and why two people are needed to lead a Department of Government Efficiency, but which seems kind of ironic considering that you would think it would be more efficient to have one person running the department. But it is also named after a meme that is a meme of a dog, Doge, and then also a cryptocurrency coin that Elon Musk has supported in the past called Dogecoin. It is just phenomenally stupid that we have a actual government agency in the United States that is now named after a meme and a cryptocurrency coin. So, I really just kind of raised this because it is one of the more unusual moves that has been made in the transition team's announcements and appointments thus far, but it's unclear to me exactly what this department might be doing or will do, but curious if anyone has thoughts on that.
All I'll say about that, I think the most notable, interesting part of that department actually is the fact that there are two heads, meaning nobody actually wanted to give either one of them the authority to head the thing up, which I think is an indicator of just how much esteem Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are actually held by people in the administration. Perhaps we will see, but you could have seen either of those people. They could have made them the head of the OIRA, right? The Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, a super, super influential office in the White House that looks at a lot of the same stuff, more on the regulatory side than staffing or internal personnel side, but super influential office. And that's not what they did. They let them make up their own acronym and their own little office. It's a weird little, my sense it's a weird little clubhouse they're letting these two eccentric millionaires hang out in. But we will see. Maybe it'll end up more influential than I
Yeah.
think.
So Scott, I'll just ask you, how concerned are you overall, like putting aside the Doge department, looking at all of these picks, especially in the national security space? Are you surprised? Are you concerned? Where are the areas that you're most concerned and where are the areas that you're most hopeful?
Yeah, can I just add a quick question to Anna's, Scott, before you start answering? But one of the things that throughout the campaign we've been worried about is how much Trump administration would adopt the Project 2025 agenda. And so when you see these picks, is there an alignment between what Project 2025 has put forth and the positions that these people have espoused in the past?
Those are all really good questions. And I do think it's interesting. I mean, this is not as Project 2025 or as mega-E a set of appointments as I think we might have expected. Like, at least in my mind, the narrative going into this is that this is Trump 2.0. He's going to know to select absolute loyalists and people who will never buck him. And he's going to have kind of free reign throughout the bureaucracy. And at least when it comes to like cabinet level people, and to some extent people in his White House, that's not really who we're seeing. Like Susie Wiles, who is his chief of staff and is presumably playing a pretty strong role in staffing, along with Howard Lutnick, Linda McMahon, the heads of the transition team. Like, they are more conventional conservatives, for lack of a better term, like very conservative people, but they're not the extreme mega-E people in all regards. Like, they each have kind of ties and connections with them. And I think you're seeing that in some of the cabinet positions, like Marco Rubio, a guy who's been very strong backer of Trump, campaigning for him, but was his own voice in the Senate and has been. And frankly, that's a political career that both predates and will probably outlast Donald Trump's. He's, among other things, he was the co-sponsor of the provision that the Senate passed trying to bar withdrawal from NATO, which was something that has a clear kind of like Trump equity. He's got very different foreign policy views. Now, he hasn't actually been announced yet, so maybe that's a reason he hasn't been, and maybe he'll end up getting dropped. But he and a number of these figures strike me as people that have their own kind of centers of gravity. Like, they're the kind of people that aren't that different from the people we saw get pulled in to Trump's first term. Some of those people even though they had kind of independent power gravities, ended up being kind of sycophantic and kind of going along with Trump anyway. And they didn't really become focuses of resistance or kind of keeping things on the rails. But other people did end up being kind of people who kept things on the rails in kind of unexpected ways. So I don't know. Personally, I'm not seeing this as a sign that this administration so far is going to be all that different from the last administration. A lot more factors go into it than that. And frankly, we may want to look more at what happens lower in the bureaucracy, particularly at positions that either don't need Senate confirmation or have much lower profile Senate confirmation, because that may be a spot where you sneak in a lot more Kash Patels and other people who have been shown a willingness to do things that really push the legal and ethical limits in ways that benefit, that advance a particular agenda. That is a possibility, but we'll have to wait and see. I'm not sure we 100% know on that. Roger, what's your sense of this? I have an aspect I want to pull your in. I'd be curious about your perspective, because the other part of this that jumps out to me, and this is my bugaboo, right, about this whole thing, is that we can only learn so much from the people who actually are popping out of this, but we can learn a lot about the process that's arriving at these decisions. And that's the thing I've been most surprised by, because we're seeing a lot of these people come out in ways that are very clearly surprising people outside of, I guess, Mar-a-Lago, where all these decisions are being debated. The one that really jumps out to me is when Pete Hegseth is announced, like he actually has been announced as the nominee for Secretary of Defense. Lisa Murkowski was reported, I think it was Andrew Desiderio at Politico, reported he was there when she found out. She was just like, wow, who is that? That's not a good sign when you have 53 senators, 50 of whom you need to get on board with confirming your nominee, if you didn't even run it by one of them in your own party. And Lisa Murkowski is a little bit of an oddball in that party. But nonetheless, I mean, that doesn't strike me as like a super, super efficient process of the site we might expect, not least because there's no reason you need to get the nominees out now. You could wait a week or 2 or 3 and run them by folks in the Senate and do some more due diligence. But somebody's got their finger on the Twitter on Truth Social and is truthing these things out and loving the attention. And I think I know who that is. So I don't know, Roger, am I wrong? Am I being too, I don't know, it's either optimistic or pessimistic, right? It's like, I just am so far, feel like the decision-making process is as quixotic and inefficient and problem-laden as it was during the first term. And I don't see signs of it getting a lot better. But am I wrong on that? Do you think it's a little more efficient?
Well, I'm pretty far out of my silo here. I'll just weigh in nevertheless.
That's the name of the game, Roger. That's okay. That's what we do here at National Security.
Just disregard what I'm about to say. No, I don't have an understanding of the unifying principle here. The one I do, the Elon Musk one concerns me more than maybe it concerns you. I mean, there are just so many conflicts of interest. There are so many departments of government that are either supposed to regulate or even investigate, his various companies. And also, this is the efficiency sort of czar. He cut about 75% of Twitter's, staff. This is going to be something to watch. And also his relationship with Trump, at least for the moment, I don't know how long it lasts. We've never seen something. I don't think we've seen this before. He's in the Christmas picture. He's in on calls to foreign dignitaries, to Zelensky, to others. I haven't seen this before. And they're big personalities. You wouldn't expect this to last forever. The sort of Putin Prigozhin comes to my mind, but that's a little cruel. But it doesn't sound like this can go on forever. I sort of hope not.
Well, and there are already reports in terms of Elon that the Trump campaign, the transition team, is getting a little bit irritated, that there are sentiments within the transition team that he's overstayed his welcome, that he's acting as if he is co-president. So at least with respect to the kind of internal personnel, it seems that there's some friction there between Elon and people who are more longtime Trump loyalists. So we'll see how that plays out. But Roger, I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about Susie Wiles or other folks in the campaign who have been witnesses or are reported to have been witnesses in the criminal cases against Trump. Susie Wiles is one of those who is announced to be the chief of staff, but there are some other folks here and there as well. What do you make of that, and what was the role, or what do you kind of take away from that, the fact that there are so many people who are being announced as picks for the cabinet or for the administration who potentially played a role in testifying against or as witnesses in the criminal cases against Trump?
Yeah, Susie Wiles is mentioned in the indictment, at least according to, not by name, obviously, according to ABC and also Catherine Falders and the New York Times, Alan Foyer, probably others verified, and twice. I believe it looks like she spoke to the FBI at least twice. I don't know if she was a grand jury witness. And there's an allegation in the indictment about Trump waving a classified map in front of a PAC representative at the Bedminster Club in New Jersey. This was one of the things that I know Scott wanted
My
to...
favorite aspect of this investigation.
Make a completely indifferent indictment based on this in New Jersey. But, and Trump says something to the effect that, don't get too close, I'm not allowed to show you this. And then the other thing is she's involved in a signal chat discussion with Trump employee 5, who I don't know who is confidently, and Nauta, when there's discussions about whether De Oliveira is loyal. And this is when they're deciding whether to get him counsel. So, yes, she does testify against him, sort of. In other words, this was useful to the government in that Trump is admitting that he knows these are classified documents. She may have viewed it as helpful to him in that she was saying, don't get too close. So it's not distribution of secrets. It's mere willful retention of secrets. And she might not have appreciated the difference, and maybe he doesn't either. But he was willing to tolerate this. It seems that when, for instance, Hope Hicks testified, it sounds like that might have been a much more of a breaking point. The other point was whether she evidently was involved in the process of finding counsel for people, and it's apparent there are excerpts from an FBI 302 or what, I'm not sure if that's the correct name, but no, it was a transcript of her talking to FBI, very, very short transcripts. I believe it's her, it's I can't be certain because it's person 49, but I believe it's her. And again, Alan Foyer thinks it's her. The government seemed to think that the process of finding counsel was sort of contingent on people being loyal. And, loyal would mean not ratting out the president. And it would also mean that, maybe you could argue not telling the truth. And she pushed back very hard on that in one, or whoever person 49 is, pushed back very hard on that notion. But that was sort of the hinted at in the indictment. So it's somebody who's very loyal, but she's not accused of wrongdoing in the indictment. She's just a witness. I'm not sure about other people. There are a couple names that have come up as possible White House counsel people. One of those, in fact, is Stan Woodward, who was one of the lawyers that was being tapped by Wiles for witnesses. And in fact, it appears that special counsel at one point was tracking the phone contacts, got phone records, and was looking at how many times did she call Woodward and for how long and what dates. And the same with Boris Epstein. But it actually wasn't that many calls that they found. I think it was only like 4. He did represent a ton of people in both investigations. And then he represented Yusul Taveras. Well, he represents Nauta, Waltine Nauta. He represented Yusil Taveras, who's Trump employee 4. Eventually, the special counsel. In fact, the special counsel challenged him sort of twice. They tried to get judges to appoint new counsel because on the theory that he was conflicted. They did appoint in D.C. a new counsel was appointed for Taveras, who then did cooperate against Trump. Judge Cannon did not adopted a slightly different approach, held a hearing, and effectively additional lawyers were hired for certain witnesses, I think. He also represented Kash Patel, Dan Scavino, Peter Navarro. Among the January 6th cases, he represented Kelly Meggs, who was an Oath Keeper, seditious conspiracy guy. He got 12 years. Ryan Samsel, who was one of the very, very, very first rioters to topple the first barricade onto Officer Caroline Edwards. Woodward recently broke his representation with Samsel, or vice versa. I don't know why. And then Federico Klein, who was that was a blue collar case. That was a guy who stormed the Capitol and got 70 months. But he was a political appointment in the State Department.
Well, folks, we are going to have a lot more to learn about and talk about these people for months and years of our lives to come, for better or for worse. But that is all the time we have together this week for Rational Security. But of course, this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Eugenia, what do you have for us this week?
So I continue to not have a video game to...
It's disappointing.
It's just, I'm replaying all of Dragon Age. I'm sorry, it takes time. But what I do have, I want to prove to people that I do go outside sometimes. I'm not just in front of my computer all the time. So I actually want to recommend something to the people who are living in DC or visit DC. There is an exhibit at the National Gallery of Art called 1874, The Birth of Impressionism. It celebrates the 150th anniversary of an exhibition in Paris that was considered to be the first Impressionist show. No, I'm not a art connoisseur. I am pretty simple when it comes to art, but I went and I loved it and I learned a lot. So anyone who is also interested in learning a lot about Impressionism, it is, I think, running until sometime in January. So you have time to go and enjoy some lovely art.
This is actually the rare double Rational Security Object Lesson endorsement. Quinta Jurecic endorsed this same exhibit, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago when she was last on the show.
Oh, no!
But it looks amazing. I'm very excited about it, as I talked about then. But I think it looks phenomenal. It's on my list to see. Probably not till January when I finally have some time. Hopefully sometime soon. Anna Bauer, what do you have for us this week?
Yes. So I love terrible movies that I can laugh at. And I went to see Megalopolis a few weeks ago. And it was the craziest movie-going experience that I've ever had. I don't even know how to explain this film. It's so bizarre. And I hate that it's probably out of theaters by now because honestly, I feel like you've got to go see it in theaters to get the full experience. And to hear other people behind you just kind of like laughing out loud and whispering at how bizarre everything is. But it's a really weird movie. It is like, again, I'm just not going to try to describe it anymore other than just to say, if you like movies that are so bad and so weird that it's entertaining and enjoyable, then I highly recommend Megalopolis.
That is a fair endorsement. I think just the Adam Driver haircut alone, I think I saw a still shot of, which was absurd enough that was all I needed to know about the movie.
Did you see the viral clip of his "In the Club" line? Do you know
No,
what
he
I'm
hasn't
talking
in the
about?
clear line. No, but I want to know.
I'm not going to explain any further, Scott, but
All right, well, there you go. That's your official object lesson, is the In the Club clip, I think, officially now. Well, for my object lesson, I am going to encourage folks to go back and listen to this past Sunday's episode, the Lawfare Archive. That is, of course, episodes for the Lawfare podcast archives that we replay on weekends for your interest, and usually because they have some tie-in. Because this was a special one. This was called the First Day of the Rest of Our Lives edition, and this was the conversation that we, by which I mean we, is prior Lawfare and prior Lawfare contributors, not me, because this is even before my time, had in 2016, after the 2016 election, where a very early Rational Security with the original 1.0 hosts had a conversation about their reaction to the election, what it meant, what it might mean. And I mention this because, of course, we have just come through another historic election that caught a lot of people unawares, has a lot of people really wondering what is ahead, curious, dreading perhaps what is ahead. And I remember listening to that podcast episode when I was out in my pre-Lawfare life and really finding some solace to the fact that there were other people out there who care about the law, who care about national security, who like to get into the weeds and were there to help me think through it and figure out what is happening. And we just want you to know that we are here for you as well in this time, both at Lawfare and here at Rational Security. We are going to have a lot of questions in the years to come, a lot of issues we need to address, a lot of things to talk over. And that's what we're here to do. And we are never at a shortage of topics to talk about. That is going to be more true than ever in the time to come. And we hope you will stick with us for the ride and keep listening. Write in. Let us know what you want to have us to talk about. Let us know what we can do to make the listening experience better, to talk about things you care about, to bring things to the fore, and to better navigate this very tricky time. We want to hear from you, and we really appreciate it and appreciate your continued support. Roger, what do you have for us this week?
Well, I'll be the third person to recommend this exhibit, the 1874. I'll just point out two additional points about it. One thing that makes it sort of unique, at least for me, is the way they do it is they pair the two. The official Salon exhibit of 1874, the sort of approved jury exhibit of approved works by the Academy and all and the institutions, and they have 50 works from there, and then they compare that to this first exhibition of the group that that includes painters we now call Impressionists, and it's quite fascinating, and often it does confirm what you've always been taught about the innovative nature of the Impressionists. At the same time, it's nuanced, and there are paintings you see where you just don't know until you look at the label which exhibit this was in, and also in the stuffy old Salon exhibit, there's some great stuff. So it's fascinating that way. The other thing is that there's a little history to remind you that one of the worst years in French history occurred, 3 years before this exhibit, the terrible year, mid-1870 to mid-1871, where the Franco-Prussian War, the siege of Paris, and the Paris Commune, which ended with about 15,000 people being mowed down or executed as a civil rebellion was crushed. And so that was closer to the first exhibition of Impressionists than like January 6th is to us now. So it's and in fact, Paris wasn't even the capital that year because of that. The capital had been moved to Versailles. So it's just a fascinating exhibit. You won't look at Impressionism in the same way.
In other words, it might be a good time to start drawing, get into some art. Maybe this is the moment that's coming for us of some comparable artistic accomplishment. Well, on that note, that, of course, brings us to the end of this week's episode. But Rational Security is a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page, for links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series, including our forthcoming series, Escalation, on the conflict in Ukraine. While you are at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter or X at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. In addition, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was me, and flying solo for once in the production department. And our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan, and we were once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patcha. On behalf of my very special guests, Eugenia, Roger, and Anna, I am your host, Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.